Canada co-hosted an event during the week of the UN General Assembly calling for unity against arbitrary detention and leaning on lessons learned from the two Michaels.
Imagine it. What if they came for you?
In a rare public appearance, Michael Kovrig opened up about what kept him going during his 1,000-plus days in a Chinese prison.
Without coordinated advocacy, pressure, and negotiation, the sad reality is that I might still be sitting in that cell right now. Too many are still trapped in similar political nightmares.
Some of those still wrongfully detained include Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich and Canadian-American Paul Whelan, both in Russia. Roger Carstens is the U.S. Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs. He is working to bring them and others home. I spoke to Ambassador Carstens from the United Nations. Ambassador Roger Carstens, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me today.
Obviously, a lot of your work takes place behind the scenes when a case becomes designated as wrongfully detained. I'm wondering if you can sort of paint a picture for us of how challenging it is right now to free someone who's wrongfully detained in 2023.
Well, great question. It's very hard. I often say it's in the PhD level of difficulty. These nations, they're hard negotiators. They usually want things that it's going to be very hard for us to give. You know, you think in a lot of negotiations, it's usually something where you try to find an accommodation that helps out both sides. In this one, we're actually talking about moral issues and dealing with moral hazards.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's really hard to get to a solution. But having said that, under the Biden administration, we've so far brought back 35 Americans. So even though it's difficult, we don't shy away from doing the hard work. And the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, they don't shy away from their support and making hard decisions.
So when we see countries like Russia, Iran, China, of course, as Canada well knows, use arbitrary detentions, what does that tell you that they believe hostage diplomacy is working? And how do we send a message that it isn't?
You know, I think to an extent they do. I can say that, and this is an interesting statistic, came out in the Foley Foundation report that was released just about a week ago. It seems that wrongful detentions are actually on the decrease right now. There was a drop in 22% over the last year. But having said that, it's still a tool of some of these nation states. They use hostage diplomacy as a way of getting some of their objectives met. And Canada's done a wonderful job in providing leadership in this area. As you probably remember, about 2 years ago, Canada launched the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations. As of last night, we have 74 signatories. We had, I think, 2 in just the last week or so that have added themselves to that list. And last night, Canada hosted an event, I should say co-hosted, with the United States, Malawi, and Costa Rica. It was an event that brought together over 40 foreign ministers to talk about this topic, arbitrary detention and state-to-state relations. And all these countries committed to finding ways to take this horrible practice and put it on the dustbin of history, whether it's through finding new tools, using stronger diplomacy, or creatively thinking about how to stop this horrible practice.
I want to ask you about a couple cases, if I can. First of all, the most recent one, you were on the plane a few days ago when 5 Americans were freed from Iran. What do you say to critics, Ambassador, though, who say that, particularly with Iran and the U.S., there is a cycle of hostage swapping, and that the U.S. should not, in this case, have unfrozen $6 billion in assets, that might actually encourage Iran to keep up with detaining Americans?
I'd say maybe 3 things to say. The first is that Iran has a history of doing this. Whether we did something or did not do something, Iran's probably going to take hostages. And that's why we really need to pull together, under Canada's leadership, to build together a multilateral coalition that can stop this. Maybe the second thing is, to me, that this was a good deal. I mean, picture this. We took some funds that were located in the Republic of South Korea, not frozen funds, but the Iranians still had access to that money. We moved it to Qatar, put more restrictions on it, put it under the oversight of the U.S. Department of Treasury, restricted it for the use only of buying humanitarian goods and services, and for that, we got 7 Americans back. I say 5 detainees and 2 of the family members that came back with them as well. So to my mind, this was a good deal. We didn't spend U.S. money, we did not pay a ransom. We simply took it from one restricted account into a much more restricted account and just required that it's being used for the things that the Iranian people may need in terms of humanitarian assistance and services.
Let's talk about Wall Street journalist Evan Gershkovich. He's been detained since March. We've talked about it here before. This week, his latest appeal was denied. He's still detained. What can you tell us about where his case stands and what you're doing to get him out?
Great question. I'm going to do one of those things that we do in the government and pivot. You've asked about Evan, and I'll get to him, but I wouldn't mind bringing up Paul Whelan, who's
he
not
was my
only
next
a
question,
United
but
States
go ahead.
citizen.
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to say, not only is Paul Whelan a U.S. citizen, but he's also a citizen of Canada, too.
Yep.
And we've been working very hard, sadly for years, to try to bring him home. And right now we are currently trying to come up with creative paths to making that happen. We have a route that we're pushing forward on. We've had discussions with the Russians. It's the same channel that's been open when we had discussions on Brittany Griner and Trevor Reed. So I think we're going to find a way to do it, although it's going to be hard fought. And we're grateful to have a chance to work with Canada on these types of issues. In terms of Evan, the Russians not really yet started talking about him. They have a history of taking someone through a complete trial process. After they're convicted, they sentence them, and then the Russians are more willing to talk about what it's going to take to bring him back. If there's a way that we can short circuit that and speed up the clock, hurry up the timeline and bring him home sooner before he has to go through a trial process, well, we're certainly going to explore that. But as of right now, the Russians really haven't been open to discussing Evan.
When you mentioned Paul Whelan, I know that I've talked to his brother, I've talked to his sister for those reasons, because he's partly Canadian. When Brittany Griner got released, when you were able to have that happen, I know you had to have you did have a conversation with Paul Whelan. I'm wondering if you can tell me a bit about how hard that was to tell him that he was not getting out, but somebody else was.
Yeah, that was a hard phone call. I've had many in this job. That might be number one. We dropped Brittany Griner off at Fort Sam Houston, a military base in Texas, at 4:30 in the morning. And by 9:30 in the morning, Paul was able to make a phone call from his prison in Russia. And we talked for 30 minutes. He asked, what happened? Was I left behind? And I explained, Paul, you weren't left behind. It was the only deal that the Russians were going to offer. There was no way to get you home on this round. And the president had to make a decision between bringing Brittany home on this deal or not bringing anyone home. That was the only deal going. And I can remember Paul at the very end of it said, this is a great day for Brittany Griner. It's a great day for her family, and it's a great day for the United States of America. And Paul's a tough guy. He's resilient. He's a Marine, and he's been incredibly tough during this entire experience. Now, granted, he wants to come home, and we're working as hard as we can to bring him home. But in terms of how he took that phone call, he took it like a champ. He was incredibly mature and resilient. He was impressive. I would hope that if I was in those circumstances, I could have been just as tough.
I want to end on this. Michael Kovrig was, of course, at the event at the UN talking about arbitrary detention, one of the Canadians that China detained for so long. And he talked about the costs of arbitrary detention for the perpetrators and a hope that there might be more done to increase deterrence. What would you think the U.S. and Canada and others can do on that front, Ambassador, in order to try and prevent it from happening at all?
I mean, Canada really started us off on the right foot. The declaration was a great first move. It's, to an extent, establishing a norm in the international community that nations will not tolerate this behavior by countries that are willing to take people and hold them as political pawns. And we're progressing forward. I think I can see a world in which eventually countries start to band together in a multilateral effort in a way to raise the cost of those prices, or rather of taking hostages. We're already off to a good start. We've spent a lot of time talking to the Canadians and other allies to determine what tools we have that have never been put into the service of trying to end this scourge, and also what tools we might need to create, working with our own parliaments and legislatures to come up with these new and creative ways to put this to an end.
Okay, Ambassador Carstens, good of you to make the time for Canada. Thank you, sir.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.